So now we'll go to the panel discussion. Before we jump into a couple of the pre-organized subjects, I will say, Steve, have we received any questions from the floor?
Yes, we have. We've got 3 questions to go with.
Sure. Why don't you hold on to those for now? If we have anybody who wants to unmute their phone and ask the question directly, then please have them do that. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll cover a couple of discussion points first, and then we'll make sure that we leave time at the end for those questions.
Okay.
So the first one is privacy is an IT function. I got a guy. So is it really just a function of IT? Is privacy something that we can manage purely with technology? Ian?
You know, as you said, it's a great come up all the time. If people think privacy, they think IT. The way I look at it is, the way I tell people about it is, you know, technology is how you do it, but data privacy and data compliance is why you do it. So it's the education side of it. It's the understanding what you're doing with information, where you're putting the information, how you're storing the information, all the things we talked about in the first part of the conversation. So yeah, IT definitely plays a part. I mean, everyone uses technology in their business, or most people do, but that's the how. That's the you know, the button pressing, and that's the collecting of the information maybe. But you need the education, you need the training, you need the understanding to you know, to build a better mousetrap, right? More goes into it than just the technology side of it. You have to make sure you understand, you know, what you should be doing, what you can be doing, and what you must be doing.
And Steve, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just feel very sorry for all these IT guys out there that get lumbered with the problems that arise through privacy. So, you know, we talk about our privacy ecosystem, and there are 6 functions of an ecosystem, and cyber and IT is just one of those functions or habitats that we look at. So there are more elements and functions within the wider privacy ecosystem. And as I say, IT is a fundamental part of it, but it's not the whole scenario. And we were on a call with the UK security services a couple of days ago, and 9 out of 10 IT and cyber breaches are actually caused by human error. So you may have an IT manager who's got a firewall and managing a DNS system and looking at all these vulnerabilities and threats, but the real risk is the human risk, somebody clicking on to potentially a phishing email. So, you know, education is just as fundamental into privacy as potentially the IT side of it as well.
I'll build on that with a couple of observations. Thank you both for that input. So absolutely, cybersecurity is an essential part of the solution. We really cannot be compliant without the support of technology, but it really is people, process, technology. And as Ian and Steve have pointed out, that is the case. A recent survey showed with CIOs showed that more than 80% of them felt the biggest risk to privacy and cybersecurity is their own employees. And that's not necessarily nefarious. Keep in mind that there's a lot of focus put on external hackers, but really a data breach is just any unauthorized access. So it certainly cannot just be addressed as an IT function. So let's move on to privacy benefits. This is something that doesn't necessarily get spoken about enough. We certainly understand inherently that there are consequences for not being privacy compliant, but there's also a lot of benefits to our business. We have touched on some of those, where there's data management, the additional benefits of having a privacy policy. But Ian, would you like to offer some insight into some of the ways that being privacy compliant and moving toward privacy compliance helps your overall business operation?
Sure. I mean, you touched on it a few minutes ago on a different topic, but more and more consumers, more and more customers are aware of the importance of their data and protecting that data. So, you know, studies have shown that more and more consumers are actively looking to do business with people who they feel are looking after their data in a safe manner and only collecting the data they need. And, you know, example is now when you fill out a form, people are very reluctant now, for example, to put in their year of birth, because Why do they need your year of birth? What's the rationale for that? It used to be in every form, we should all fill it in. And now people say, no, I'm not going to fill that in. You don't need that. And just like if you walked into a business and you saw, files spread all over the back counter with names on it that you could read and what their illness was or what their financial situation was or what their police record was, you would probably have a very detrimental view of that business. You would, you don't want to spend your money, spend your time in a place that doesn't take your data privacy seriously. So it is a benefit to your business. People want to know the data is safe. They want to know the data is being used for the right reason. And they want to know that you're extending that beyond your own operation to anybody else you may be sharing information with down the road. So,
Steve, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, what I'd like to focus on is marginalized groups. So we're looking at organizations that help marginalized demographics in our society. And there's a lot of focus on what we call DEI data, which is diversity, equality and inclusion data. So it could be things such as religion, it could be your sexual orientation, it could be religious beliefs or trade union memberships. And it's deciding how those pieces of information can be used to benefit, first and foremost, the people that we're collecting it on their behalf, and then also the growth of our business as well. So we can demonstrate to marginalized groups that we are providing services based on the information that we are collecting. And again, it goes back to data minimization. If we are only collecting small amount of information, we can only be providing small amount of services back to a small area. If we open that up a little bit and we are looking at DEI data, we could be looking at health information, we could be looking at mental health information, disabilities, because we can be then providing more resources back to our marginalized groups. It could be schools, it could be education, it could be people who have just come out of prison and are trying to go back into society. So privacy really does benefit everybody, not just the business or the organization, but also the people that are potentially using our services or looking to use our services also.
Excellent points, both of you. And again, that's a very good point about not all data is the same. Some data can be very sensitive and have extremely negative consequences if it does get out. So just as a quick recap, we do understand some of the benefits are building trust with our customers, partners, and employees, reducing our exposure or risk, creating a competitive advantage, reducing cost through increased efficiencies by getting rid of data that we don't actually need, more uptime and system stability. And something else I'd like to introduce, and this is more specific to the privacy policy that I had said I would touch on previously, is that this actually is it's becoming more often now a requirement of third parties. So for instance, if you want to have an app on the App Store, Google requires you to have a privacy policy. If you want to use Google Analytics, they require you to have a privacy policy. Some e-commerce platforms will not allow you to have an online store unless you have a privacy policy. And this also can affect your search. So search engines are more likely to prioritize sites that have a privacy policy because it shows a higher level of trust and compliance. So those are some benefits that you may not think about. But again, in today's wired world, with us having a much larger online presence, those are very real benefits.
Could I add one thing in there, Nigel? Because that's
absolutely
takes me on to something with privacy policy. So if you have a Canadian or a United States business and they're looking for European customers, again, with the privacy policy, we have what we call cookies. Now, we know cookies collect lots of information and sort of profile us and follow us around where we're shopping around the world. But if a US or a Canadian company is looking at a European base, they have to have a cookie pop up that pops up from a European IP address. So even if you're based in Vancouver, Toronto, if you're in Halifax, and you're looking to target European clients, by having a privacy policy and a cookie pop-up that comes up onto your website, that makes you allowed to trade in those geographical locations. By not doing so, you can still be fined. Like we know some of the big tech companies in the US are getting fined by the European data authorities on a week-by-week basis. And this is sort of coming down to SME businesses as well. And as you said, 98% of businesses have a e-commerce platform. So we're engaged in some sort of online interaction around the world. So it's just making sure that what we have, our services and products, are protected by the privacy tools that allow us to sell to those individuals. And having those correct tools will increase our turnaround and should potentially increase our turnover as well.
And just one final thing, Nigel, to think about is, back to earlier in one of my hobby horses, if you have well-organized data for your business in the first place, then being compliant and privacy is much easier. And as a package, it makes your business much more efficient. So you need the data anyway. You need it for marketing. You need it for accounting. You need it for taxes. You need it for inventory. You need it for all kinds of reasons. And privacy is one of those many things you need to have good, solid data for in a way that you can easily access it.
Okay, so maybe we've left the best to last. I didn't want to squeeze this particular subject, but I also want to allow some time for some of those questions at the end, Steve. Data breach, those two words that we really don't want to hear. So what I will do, I know we could spend an entire session just talking about the steps that we would go through in a data breach. But I would like to summarize very quickly that at a minimum, there are three things that must be in place. The first is just knowing that we've suffered a data breach. And if we do not have any kind of access restrictions or monitoring in place, how would we even know that a breach has occurred? And the second one is being both proactive and reactive. So having a plan in place. There is no such thing as a 100% secure solution. And so something we have to hope for the best, plan for the worst. So we must have a plan in place so that when that breach occurs, and as Steve had mentioned previously, doing an impact assessment, a threat assessment, we would know enough about our business that when a breach occurs, we can make that determination of how are we going to react to this. So having that plan in place and then being able to react to a data breach. Again, those are three absolutely critical steps, items. So identifying it, knowing the severity of it, and being able to mitigate the impact are three steps that absolutely have to be in place for every business.
Can I add something very quickly there, Nigel, because this is a panel discussion. I think it's so important to
absolutely
put across to our audience. It's quite startling. 61% of cyber attacks around the world turn into an actual data breach. So for all the phishing, the ransomware, the malware, 61%, which in my mind is a high figure, actually turn out to be a data breach. That means that potentially over half of the cyber attacks need to be reported to the data authorities, because then there has been a data breach. And then we have to look into the severity of that breach and having that plan in place to ensure that our customers' information is safe and secure, and there's no significant harm to those individual persons as well. So when we do look at human error, and we're looking at the cyber error, it's quite startling that 61% turns into what we call a data breach. And we do only see the big breaches around the world where there's thousands and thousands of data individuals concerned. But this is a figure that's targeting to SME businesses. So small to medium-sized businesses are dramatically increased to be at risk from those cyber criminals.
Okay, thank you for adding that. And I know that everybody has stayed on the call and joined in the first place because they really just want to get to the privacy jeopardy. But before we move on to that, again, this panel discussion is very important. We want this to be fun, but we also want it to be very informative. So I would like to open it up again to any questions from the floor. So Steve, you said that you had a couple that had come in.
Yes, I do actually. So I got a question here about the US. So obviously Canada, the US, you trade quite a lot. So as a Canadian business, what do I need to do if I'm trading in the various US states? Am I governed under Pt2? Does Castle come into it? Or do I have to look at more sort of generalized data etiquette when I am sharing data across border into the US.
Right, and of course the American model is much more complex. There are some states, I believe we're at five states currently, that have state level legislation, partly driven by concerns of TikTok and how much information is going to the Chinese government. The federal government, the US federal government has now introduced legislation, but as you can speak to, I'll hand it back to you in a minute, Steve. We are governed by the legislation where our business operates, but again, as we have mentioned previously in the discussion, the important thing is where the individuals are located. So, Steve, did you want to add to that, or Ian?
Just the other thing to add to that is, I mean, health is very important everywhere in the world, but in the United States, it's actually far more strict than it is in Canada, with far more consequences for stepping outside the boundaries. So, along with everything that Nigel talked about and that Steve will mention in a few minutes, just be aware that if you're in the healthcare space, particularly with anything to do with patient information, the U.S. takes it even more seriously than most countries do, and the penalties for being in breach are very serious.
Yeah, and I just want to add to what Ian says there. So the penalties, it's knowing your own backyard, knowing where your customer base is, because you may not only face a financial penalty from the region that we're collecting the data, we could also face the fines from our own data authorities as well. So I'm based in the UK. I could be doing business with American and Canadian companies. I'm also governed under US law and Canadian law, as well as UK data law. So I have to be aware of those risk factors, and I have to have a plan in place to ensure that I collect that data in accordance where my customers are based, and then how I process that data. Now, an example could be we've got data sites predominantly based in the US. You know, so we've got AWS, which hosts a lot of UK businesses. We have to be aware that that data is leaving our shores. It is going across border into a different country, and it's about making sure that our customers are aware. We communicate to our customers and our PII individuals that we are storing their data in foreign countries, for a better word, and then what safeguards we have in place to ensure that that data is kept safe and secure, because obviously it's out of our jurisdiction, so we have to have extra safeguards in place. So communication is so key when we are dealing with cross-border storage.
And even though this can seem very, very overwhelming and complicated, I really want to point out that at the end of the day, regardless of where the privacy legislation resides, the goals are the same all over the world. So we can reduce a lot of that complexity by just adhering to the standard principles of privacy legislation. And with that said, you will hear the term GDPR mentioned in terms of Canada, the US, countries all over the world. And one of the reasons that it comes up is because it is considered to be the gold standard. So it covers you in two ways. One is that we will make recommendations. Again, it is up to you as a business person what you decide to implement, but our recommendations will always be toward best practices. And by meeting those high standards, then you can have that comfort level that you are covered regardless of jurisdiction. So we have about 10 minutes left in our call. Did you have another question that you want to add to that, Steve?
Yeah, I do, but I think we've already answered it in that question. So it's all about fines. Can I be fined in my own state? So when you look at Canada, we have different laws in Quebec to what you have in Ontario and into BC, etc. So the idea is, can you be fined if you're sharing data out of Quebec and you're doing it unlawfully into Toronto or into Vancouver, or obviously over into Halifax? Are we only going to be paying one penalty fine if we make a mistake, or if we do something unknowingly?
Right, and as you mentioned, that is a compounded effect, because ultimately, as you say, we have talked about jurisdiction, and you are governed by the jurisdiction of the individual's data.